Welcome to the Writers' Symposium by the Sea. My name is Dean Nelson. I'm on the journalism faculty at Point Loma Nazarene University. This is our 5th annual Writers' Symposium, and tonight we're thrilled to have George Plimpton with us. George Plimpton, who has edited or written more than 30 books, conducted interviews with some of the most prominent literary figures in the world, has done things as a journalist in his participatory journalism that the rest of us can only dream about. Boxing with Archie Moore, playing goaltender for the Boston Bruins, playing football for the Detroit Lions. The things you have done, the rest of us can only envy. I want to welcome you to our Writers' Symposium, and I want to go right to I want to talk about probably your most significant contribution to society, which is your role with the Paris Review. But I want to go right to a fearful moment that as I was reading through some things about you, you've faced slap shots from hockey players. You've had your nose broken, as I understand, by your boxing match. You've appeared on Hollywood films. All of this could be very unnerving, and yet you have said in the past, but your most fearful moment was when you played in the percussion section of the New York Philharmonic. Why was that so fearful?
Yes, I played the triangle.
Oh, that explains everything.
With the New York Philharmonic and some other percussion instruments. And the reason it was so terrifying was that in music, you cannot make a mistake. Sports, of course, is predicated on mistakes being made. I mean, in tennis, you put a big slice on the serve and hope the other fellow's not going to hit it. Or in baseball, you throw a sinker or a flutter ball or whatever in the hopes the other guy's not going to hit it. But in music, you cannot make a mistake. If you do, you destroy a piece of art. And I remember when I first joined the orchestra, there was a man there, a violinist, a fellow called Sanford. And he told me that when he first joined the orchestra, he was so frightened of making a mistake. And here's a fellow playing with a lot of other violins, particularly in rehearsal where the conductor can stop you and say it's a B flat, not a B, that he told me that he put soap on the strings of his violin so that when he played it, no sound came out. And he did that until he got a sense of confidence about where he was and what he was doing. So you can imagine how this affected me. I mean,
You'd be lathering up that triangle, I would imagine.
It's not an instrument you can lather up. When you hit it, it emits a sound. The triangle is an interesting instrument. I once gave a lecture on it. There are 3 terrifying things that can happen if you play the triangle.
Thus the name triangle, I would think.
Yes, a triad of horrors. One of them is if you pick the triangle up and you look around for the stick and you can't find the stick.
That's a problem.
The other is if you pick up the stick and you can't find the triangle. There's a third one, but I've forgotten what it is.
Well, okay, but something happened.
Well, to show you how terrifying it all was, I went on tour with the Philharmonic for a month. I'd gone to Leonard Bernstein, who was the conductor then, and asked him if I could join his orchestra for a month to learn what that was all about. Very much like joining a football team or a baseball team or whatever, what the internal business of the orchestra is like. And he said, "What can you play?" And I told him I could play a sort of a cocktail party piano. I could play Tea for Two and Deep Purple. Those were my
I was just humming those 2 in the shower this morning.
Yeah, my biggies.
Yeah.
And he said, well, we don't really have very much need for that sort of thing around here. And he sent me out to learn percussion. And what was interesting was that when I would hit the triangle properly or these other instruments, musicians have a secret way of applauding each other during the course of a piece of music. And if you watch an orchestra very carefully, sometimes you can see it. It's sort of a shuffle of the foot on the floor of the stage. There was a great oboist with the Philharmonic called Howard Gomberg, a great oboe player, and he would play something in the middle of a concerto or a symphony so brilliantly that all around they would do this little shuffling of the feet. It was their way of acknowledging his brilliance. And when I would hit this triangle properly, all over the orchestra, the feet. But then, I have to be brief about this because it's a long story, I'm afraid, but in a place called London, Ontario, we were playing Mahler's Fourth Symphony. And that starts with 18 strokes, as I recall, on an instrument called the sleigh bells, which look like a child's toy. There's a handle and the bells are like this, and you have to tap them 18 times, diminuendo. And they're enormously important notes because they're the very first ones that you hear, and they sort of set the tone and the temper of the symphony. And these things were in my charge, and I did something wrong. I think I got carried away, just didn't stop or something. Or
19, maybe?
Yeah, just banging away everywhere, or maybe not enough. I have no idea. I've never really had enough courage to find out what I did wrong, but I knew something had gone wrong because it wasn't any of this. And musicians sort of, and on shoulders and all that. And Bernstein, this awful look came over his face, and he kept grim. I remember after the performance, he came back to where I was standing with these, still holding these bells actually. I picked them up and he took them from me really quite violently, and he whacked them down onto a table there on the backstage and shouted at me that I had destroyed Mahler's Fourth, and that he never wanted to hear a sound like that out of his orchestra again. And as far as I knew, I had been fired.
Right, I would think.
And I remember he rushed out into the Canadian night after this distraught man. And the percussionists all came crowding around, and they said, "Don't worry about that, that's a typical conductor's tantrum, you'll be back with us tomorrow," and all of that. And they took me out on the town, and it was very nice of them. They kept telling me stories about percussionists who had gone wrong.
Are there a lot of those?
Well, they said he had enough stories. I remember one of them was of a, what was it, Tchaikovsky's, what is it? The the one that has fireworks in the middle of it. The what? 1812 Overture. Thank you. The right in the middle of that, there's a great thing that they have. Is outdoors they have fireworks and they shoot off cannon or rifles or whatever. Indoors they have a percussionist backstage who looks through a little hole in the curtain. And when he gets the cue, he fires off this sort of contraption into a big barrel, and that sort of gives the reverberating sound that's called for in the score. And they told me about, we were in some saloon somewhere, they were telling me all these stories, and they told me that back in the Carnegie Hall days of the Philharmonic, there was this percussionist who had fired off this instrument 60 bars too early. And they said that a lot of them thought a suicide had occurred backstage. There were a lot, they told me about this cymbal player who had brought his cymbals together like this, and one of them had come off and got unscrewed, and it landed right on its edge, like a hubcap, and it sort of went between all the chairs like that.
Kind of an interactive part of the symphony.
Well, the long and short of this is that they decided that they would go and see Bernstein, and so one of them remembered that the next night in Winnipeg we were going to be playing Tchaikovsky's Second Symphony, which is called The Little Russian. And at the end of that symphony, there's a great shot on the gong, sort of comes in like an exclamation point. And they felt I had to, climb back on the horse, get my confidence back. And so they went to see with me Bernstein in his penthouse there in the hotel in London, Ontario. It was very late at night. He was striding around with a bathrobe. I remember a terry cloth bathrobe. He's still as angry as a hornet, about what I'd done to him that night. Destroyed the Mahler. And I went in there and I was sort of propped up against a wall. And they pleaded with him, give him another chance. And so finally Bernstein said, looking at me, he said, "All right," he said, "you can play the Gong tomorrow night in Winnipeg." It's going to be in Winnipeg. On a number of conditions. He said, "First of all, I want you to watch me throughout the entire symphony. Don't look down at the music. We all know that you can't read music." He said, "You don't fool anybody when you turn the pages back there." He said, "Watch me throughout the entire symphony. And when we get to the fourth movement, about 9 minutes into it, I will give you a cue the likes of which no musician has ever seen before." And he said, "Upon that, smack it." So there I was, next night, white tie and tails, back of the orchestra. And Bernstein came in, and here's one of the other terrifying things about music, is that once it starts, there's no way that you can stop it. You know, it's not like sports where, you know, the quarterback goes like that and everything stops, so
Right.
batter steps out of the batter's box and everything stops. So, but in music, once that stick comes down, you are on this
You're committed.
treadmill, and it bears you up towards this terrible moment. And we got into the fourth movement, and poor old Bernstein, I really sort of felt sorry for him, because he would look over and he was sort of hoping to see the guy that was always there, you know, the regular percussionist, and instead he would see me sort of, you know, this gong hanging there and this huge mallet, you know, like that. It must have absolutely scared the hell out of him every time he looked over. And he gave this cue, and I read back and whacked this gong, and I don't think a gong has ever been hit that hard. It was hit so hard that the musicians in front all sort of bounced like that.
So you had been given a
great wave went out by their head, went by Bernstein, was sort of, eyes popped as it went by him, and he had to wait to bring these violins to finish this thing off, and I thought I'd done it again, you know, destroyed another symphony. But then all over the orchestra, the feet began to go like this. And so I hit it right on the button. Matter of fact, Bernstein said that he came backstage and he said, wow, you know, no one's ever hit a gong as hard as that. He said, but if Tchaikovsky heard it, which I'm quite sure he did, he would have been delighted.
Well, I don't want to let the audience feel like you know, all you have done is all of these wonderful books about different walks of life and different professions and all. I think your greatest contribution has been what you've done with the Paris Review. As the founding editor of the Paris Review more than 40 years ago, discovering writers, talking about writing, bringing new literature, celebrating creative writing, and maybe most significant, the interviews you have done with great literary figures. As I understand it, you're the only one who's ever interviewed Ernest Hemingway.
Well, I think he was interviewed by, he was teaching a high school class, or not teaching, but I think in a high school class in Ketchum, Idaho. He talked about writing to some kids there.
Other than that, though, it's you.
I think so. He did not like to talk about writing at all. He used to say that it took something out of the well. He was always talking about the well that had the content of his mind in there, and if you dipped into the craft too much, it emptied this well. He was always using that metaphor.
Now, as I recall, you made him angry during that interview. I know that comes as a great surprise to those who are familiar with Hemingway, but what did you do to set him off? Well,
I'd gone down to see him in Cuba, and we'd gone out fishing on the Gulf Stream. I'd met him in Paris, and he was on his way to Africa. He didn't really want to do the interview, and he wrote me a long letter saying why he couldn't do it and so forth. And then he changed his mind a little bit in Spain. I went down there to see him and to try to do it again, and we used to go to the bullfight. We sort of started it there, and then some of it was conducted by Mayo, because he disliked talking about it so much and liked talking about other things, really. I mean, he loved talking about fishing. And anyway, we were out fishing on the Gulf Stream, and we came into this little port called Kohima, where he kept his boat, and we were walking along this wood dock, and he was carrying a hamper of drinks, and the daiquiris, the papadobles. They were very wicked drinks. And we'd had some of these things, and I thought it was a perfect time to ask him about something that had always puzzled me a little bit, which is why in his some of the stories, when he's talking about lovemaking, there's always a bird that flies around, or very often a bird. It's when Nick is making love to a girl, an Indian girl in the pine forest, there's an owl that flits around. And the most graphic example of it is in Across the River and Into the Trees, when Colonel Cantwell is making love to the princess, the Italian, the princess, a white bird suddenly flies out of a gondola. So obviously this bird has some meaning to him. And so I thought this was a perfect time to ask him about this bird.
Right, symbolism. You wanted to know about the symbolism.
I want to know about the bird. So I said, Papa, everybody called him Papa, who got to know him, what's the significance of the bird when you're writing about sex? And it was as if I'd pricked him with a needle or something. He put down this hamper of daiquiris on the dock, and his face turned absolutely bright red under these whiskers, these white whiskers of his. And he said to me, "So you think you can do better?"
Good grief.
And I, at the time, had written a children's book called The Rabbit's Umbrella. He'd won the Nobel Prize, so what was I to say?
So he took that as a great affront to his ability?
Well, I think it was sort of poking around in areas which he didn't think should be poked around in. I mean, obviously, Hemingway is actually full of symbols, but none of them are quite as abrupt as that. I mean, for example, in Farewell to Arms, there's always this talk about the high ground versus the low ground in the swamps, which is where the bad things in human nature tend to happen. The high ground is always pure. And I think they're those massive symbols. And this one, and maybe you suddenly realize you can't do things like that. Or maybe the bird, it showed, and symbols shouldn't show that way. But wow, it was terrible because at lunch, I think it was lunch the next day, he was very interested in this fight that I had with Archie Moore, one of the great people from San Diego, and we'd had this 3-round boxing match in New York so that I could find out something rather stupidly what it was like to be in the ring with a great fighter.
Actually, you landed a fairly good punch in that.
Well, I don't remember that. I certainly remember the one he landed on me.
Well, yeah.
I don't think he recalled the one I landed on him either. But Hemingway was fascinated by this fight that I had kept asking me about over and over again. What was it like? And because he was a hugely competitive man, and he liked to tangle with people. And I remember a story about Gene Tunney, who was a heavyweight champion of the world, not long, beat Jack Dempsey. And he was down there in Cuba and went around to, Hemingway invited him around, and Hemingway's curiosity got the better of him, and he challenged Tunney to the sort of shadow box around their living room there somewhere, and at one point he couldn't resist it. He threw a punch at Tunney, low, and hit him in the kidneys and doubled him up like that. And a shadow box is supposed to hit the other fellow's hand, you know. And Tunney sort of straightened up after this, and he feinted Hemingway's arms down, his hands down, and threw a punch at his face, and he, with his big, and stopped the knuckles just a millimeter or so away from his face, just to show him that if he wanted to continue, he caved everything in, and that was the end of the shadow boxing with Hemingway. But I was not in the position, and Hemingway got up, he was having lunch, and he suddenly got up and wanted to shadow box. "I want to see how good you are," he said to me. And I got up with this bright smile. And I remember, and Miss Mary, his wife, was sitting at the table. There was a cat there, Christabel. He used to sit by Hemingway's plate, and Hemingway would drop it was like an ashtray. Hemingway would drop a little shrimp into his mouth. Supine, this cat was, like this. And Hemingway got up, and the cat got up, jumped down on the red tile floor, and began playing with a ping pong ball. I can still hear the sort of tock sound of the thing being batted around. And Hemingway came around, and I knew that he wanted to spar, do this sort of shadow boxing thing. And in the middle of this, I got up with a big smile, and we did, and then all of a sudden he hit me alongside the face. I have this unfortunate thing that happens when I get hit. Not only does the nose bleed almost automatically, but tears come out. You know, it's called sympathetic response. And so tears,
or pain, maybe.
Well, whatever it was.
Could have been.
And in the middle of all of this, bleary-eyed, through tears, I suddenly said something rather clever. I said, "How did you do that?" Because he would hold his hands down here low and then bop. And it turned him from a angry man, perhaps about the question about the sex symbols the day before, into something more. And you turned him into a teacher. Loved to teach.
Ah, okay.
So then it was all right. You know, I got buffed around a bit more, but it wasn't deadly. But he was a very difficult man to deal with, and that was one part of him, and the other part was this enormously generous man. But you're right, the interview with him is very prickly and very angry, and there are only a couple of questions which he really liked.
Wow. Well, now I want to ask you about all of the different literary figures that you have interviewed and spent time with. Out of all of those, have there been some themes about writing that have bubbled up to the top that seemed fairly consistent from writer to writer, or are they all completely different?
I think they tend to be quite different. I guess if there's one theme, it is usually how difficult writing is. Paris Review had a rather interesting idea. It was that they were going to do away with criticism and essays,
right,
and concentrate on creative work. And the only sop to the essay or to the critical review was that rather than getting critic A to write about B, that we would go to B and ask him about, or her, about writing, about the craft.
Right.
And which meant interviewing writers. And the obvious writer to interview was this great man in my college, E.M. Forster.
That was the first one you did.
That was the very first one. He was probably, at that time, the greatest living novelist in the English language. Passage to India, Howard's End, Room with a View. And so we went to Cambridge, back to King's, and interviewed him. And the interesting thing about Forster was that he had not written a novel since 1924. And the obvious thing to ask him was, what had happened? He'd written some wonderful books of nonfiction, Hills of Devi, 2 Cheers for Democracy, but had stopped writing novels completely. And he began to tell us this rather poignant thing. He said that he'd started this novel called Arctic Summer, and it took place, the great central part of the novel took place in a railroad station in London. It was either Liverpool or King's Cross, I can't remember which. And it was like the Malabar Caves in Passage to India, sort of a focal point. And and the idea of the novel was that these characters would get onto these trains, and then they would come back to this focal point, change, their lives had changed in some way. And he said to us that the trouble with what had happened, and he called it a fiction technicality, that these people had gotten onto these trains as characters, and they never came back. So here was this great English novelist who couldn't control his characters.
They were on a train somewhere.
They're still out there somewhere.
Come back.
But on the other hand, Graham Greene, when we went to interview him, thought that was one of the silliest things that he'd ever heard in his life, that he controlled his characters like galley slaves, as he put it.
Right. Graham Greene didn't believe that you followed characters around. He believed that you dictated to the characters.
Yeah, galley slaves. You tell them what, you whip them. If they get on the trains, you bring them back, or you don't put them on the trains. I think and very, very few of these writers, if any, enjoy the process. There are some that do. The Kay Boyle, for example, used to love the smell of paper. He used to love to sit down and work on it. And one of the people in this book that I'm going to chat from a little bit later on talks about Anthony Trollope, who wrote a daily schedule with 7 pages a day, day after day after day, for 7 days. And if he'd finish a novel on page 4, he would pick up a piece of paper and write chapter 1 and write 3 pages of that book.
Of the next one?
Of the next book.
Wow.
So you have people that, William Styrne, who was a friend of mine, once said that writing for him was a little bit like jumping into a very cold swimming pool. And once you got involved, you move into a sort of a zone and you enjoy it. But most people, I mean, Hemingway, to go back to him for a moment, he wrote, got up at 6 o'clock in the morning every day and wrote standing up to a bureau. And on top of the bureau, this is down in Cuba, in the Finca Bahia, there's a bureau, and then on top of it was a typewriter, and on the typewriter, on top of the typewriter, a clipboard with a little clip that said, "These must be paid." It's obviously the sort of thing you buy to put the bills under. And under that was a pad of paper on which he wrote dialogue, which was very easy for him. And on the typewriter he wrote, the prose passages. And then on the wall, above this was a cardboard cut out of the back of a packing case, I would think, and rather crudely drawn into squares, and it was a chart of days. And it would have the number of words, 353, 324, then it would jump to 700, and those were days where he'd write twice as much.
Wow.
So he could go fishing on the Gulf Stream.
So he could take a day off.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's interesting about writers counting things. Fran Lebowitz once told me that she'd gone to the New York Public Library to look at manuscripts of Mark Twain. And the curator brought out these things of Twain's and said, you know, there's something that's always puzzled us about this, are these little numbers along the side. And she said, well, I know what those are. He's counting his words.
For him. Right.
And the curator did this, and sure enough, 316,
Amazing.
yeah.
Can you give me one declarative sentence as to advice for young writers?
Yes.
Proceed.
3 words.
Okay.
Keep a journal.
Good advice.
Of all the things I regret in my life, I did not keep a journal. And even if it never gets published, it does 2 remarkable things. First of all, it hones your skill as a writer. It makes you look at the world a little bit differently too,
Right.
because if you are a writer, you tend to look at things differently. And so it makes you look at the world differently as you
Right.
spend a day. And you can't simply write about the weather. It's not fair. You have to write a portrait of the fellow teaching you in class, or a portrait of what people think about what we're saying,
Right.
or an anguish that one goes through, or a puzzle or something. And then that's one thing that does, and even if it's of no use to you, it's certainly of use to your grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And I keep a journal only when I'm on an assignment. When I was with the Detroit Lions, for an example, I used to keep a notebook in my helmet.
That must have been comfortable.
Well, it was odd. I think the other players all thought I was a rookie with a bad memory. I'd take this thing out and write little things, because it's hard to remember, you know. And then in the evening I would take these notebooks and I'd write them in a long ledger-like journal, so it had a sort of an official thing to it.
Okay.
It's a very good idea to buy rather a grand-looking book to write in, too.
That helps?
It does, because you want to fill up its pages, and if you keep them in little notebooks, it doesn't really work all that well, but you get a ledger and you do it every single day. And then I think you sharpen all sorts of things, your sense of perception, you improve your mind, you write down things that you read in the paper that are interesting you, that interest you. I read a quote of Wallace Stevens today just by chance. He talks about how wonderful imperfection is in a universe. And I thought that's a good line, how important imperfection is, because I'd just seen the new stadium that you're building here down in San Diego, which has got a warehouse as one of the walls, like the Green Monster, except it's a warehouse. And I thought that bit of imperfection will make that ballpark quite fascinating. So I thought I'll write down Wallace Stevens' line, and guess what? I haven't written it down.
George Plimpton, you are a treasure, and it's been a privilege having you with us. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.